A racist police officer illegally detains a black woman, completely unaware that she's a decorated Navy SEAL. What happens next will leave him humiliated and a community inspired. Have you ever witnessed someone being unfairly targeted like this? Or maybe you've experienced the sting of prejudice yourself. Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Emily Carter moved with purpose along the bustling streets of Arlington's downtown district. Despite her casual attire, simple jeans, a gray t-shirt, and sneakers, there was a quiet confidence about her that turned heads. A leather messenger bag rested against her hip, its contents organized and unremarkable. Tonight was supposed to be simple, a quiet trip to the local bookstore to pick up a novel. After months of grueling deployments as a Navy SEAL, she finally had time to breathe. As she approached the corner of a busy intersection, the sharp screech of tires cut through the ambient hum of the city. A police cruiser pulled to an abrupt stop, and Officer Mike Thompson stepped out. His crisp uniform and calculated movements gave him an air of authority, but his narrowed eyes betrayed something else: suspicion. "Hey, you!" Mike barked, his voice cutting through the din of the street. Emily halted mid-stride, turning her head slightly to meet his gaze. Her posture remained relaxed, but her mind was already assessing the situation. "You in a hurry to get somewhere?" he continued, his tone accusatory. Emily raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Just heading to the bookstore," she replied evenly. Mike's eyes flicked to her bag, then back to her face. "That bag of yours, what's in it? Anything I should know about?" His words were loaded, more statement than question. Emily's grip on the strap of her bag tightened subtly, though her face gave nothing away. She could feel the weight of the interaction shifting, the tone becoming more pointed. "Just personal items," she said. Mike's posture stiffened as he folded his arms, his hand hovering dangerously close to his holstered weapon. "Mind if I take a look?" Emily paused, holding his gaze for a moment before responding. "Officer, is there a reason you're stopping me?" Her voice was calm but firm, a subtle challenge in her tone. "You fit the description," Mike said, a vague answer designed to assert dominance. "Description of what exactly?" Emily asked, taking a step forward. She wasn't aggressive, but her deliberate movements were enough to make Mike shift his weight. "I'll ask the questions," he snapped, his voice rising slightly as if volume could mask his growing unease. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Pedestrians who had been minding their business slowed their pace, their gazes drawn to the exchange. A few stopped entirely, phones discreetly emerging from pockets. Emily noticed the attention, but kept her focus on Mike. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer," she said, her voice measured. "But if you're accusing me of something, I think I have the right to know what it is." Mike's jaw clenched. He took a step closer, his boots clicking against the pavement. "Drop the bag," he ordered, his tone sharper now. Emily didn't move immediately. Her eyes locked onto his, searching for intent. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "I'm not resisting, but you're going to need to explain why you're doing this in front of all these people." Mike glanced around for the first time, his sharp gaze darting toward the small crowd forming. Their silent presence only seemed to irritate him further. "Drop it," he repeated, this time with his hand inching toward the grip of his gun. Emily slowly swung the bag off her shoulder and held it out. "Here," she said, her tone devoid of fear but brimming with authority. "Let's get this over with." The tension was palpable, crackling in the air between them. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Mike hesitated, seemingly caught off guard by Emily's calm defiance. A woman's voice cut through the quiet murmurs. "What's going on here?" she asked, phone raised, clearly recording. Mike's eyes darted toward the woman, then back to Emily. His composure faltered for a moment before he snatched the bag from her hand. He rummaged through it with an exaggerated intensity, his movements stiff and erratic. Emily stood motionless, her arms crossed. "Find anything interesting, officer?" she asked, her tone neutral, but with an edge that hinted at her growing impatience. Mike straightened, holding the bag awkwardly as he glanced back at the crowd. More phones were pointed in his direction now, their lenses capturing every moment. "You're acting suspicious," he said, though the conviction in his voice had wavered. Emily tilted her head, her expression unchanged. "Walking down the street is suspicious now?" Mike bristled, his lips pressing into a thin line. The growing crowd had become a jury of sorts, their silent scrutiny amplifying the pressure. "Step back," Mike ordered, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward her with his free hand. Emily didn't move. Her calm demeanor only seemed to unnerve him further. I'm standing right here, she said, her voice unwavering. Not running, not hiding. But if you want to escalate this, everyone here will see exactly how it unfolds. Mike's face flushed, his authority slipping away under the weight of public scrutiny. The bystanders began to murmur more audibly, their voices carrying phrases like, "This doesn't seem right," and "What did she do?" Emily held his gaze, her stance unyielding. She knew she wasn't just defending herself. She was standing against something larger, an unspoken system of prejudice and power that Mike had unknowingly brought to the surface. The tension in the air thickened, the crowd leaning in, waiting for what would happen next. Mike's grip tightened on the strap of Emily's bag as he set it aside. His stern gaze shifted back to her, and his hand hovered dangerously close to his holstered weapon. "Hands behind your back," he commanded, his tone harsher, his words cutting through the hum of the crowd. "You're being detained for questioning." Emily's posture didn't change, her hands remaining at her sides. Her voice was calm but firm. "On what grounds, officer?" "Detained for what exactly?" "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Mike replied sharply. Emily's expression remained neutral, but her words carried an edge. "What description is that?" "Female. Black. Breathing." The corner of Mike's mouth twitched as he struggled to maintain his composure. "That's not for you to question," he said, taking a step closer. "Hands behind your back now." Emily exhaled slowly, her calm demeanor unwavering. With deliberate movements, she reached into her back pocket. Mike tensed, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Relax," she said firmly, pulling out a sleek black card holder and flipping it open. "Here's my identification." She handed it to him, her fingers steady. Mike hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching the card holder. His eyes flicked over the military ID, the embossed words, United States Navy SEAL, staring back at him. The rank, the name, the official insignia, all indisputable proof of her status. For a moment, Mike's confidence faltered, his sharp gaze softening ever so slightly. But he quickly schooled his features, his voice defensive. "This doesn't exempt you from suspicion," he muttered, shoving the card holder back at her. Emily caught it effortlessly and slipped it into her pocket. Her tone remained level. "No, it doesn't. But it does prove I'm not the criminal you're fishing for. So, again, what exactly am I being accused of?" Mike's jaw tightened, his authority slipping under the weight of her calm defiance. "It's just protocol," he snapped. "Protocol?" Emily repeated, her tone cutting. "Protocol to stop someone without cause? To accuse them of being a suspect without evidence? It's for public safety," Mike countered, though his words lacked conviction. "Public safety," Emily echoed, her voice steady. "So I'm a threat because I'm walking to a bookstore? Or is it the color of my skin that makes me suspicious?" The crowd murmured audibly now, some voices rising in agreement. "She's got a point," someone said from the back. Mike's face reddened, his grip on his composure slipping further. "Look," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "I'm just doing my job." Emily's expression hardened, her gaze piercing. "Your job? Is your job to protect and serve? Or is it to harass and profile? Because right now, it looks like you've chosen the latter." Mike opened his mouth to retort, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. His eyes darted to the growing crowd. Phones were pointed at him, their lenses capturing every moment. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Mike finally said, his voice a mix of irritation and desperation. "No, officer," Emily said, taking a step forward, her tone sharp and unyielding. "You made this harder the moment you decided to stop me without cause. So let me ask you again. What description am I supposedly fitting? What's the real reason you stopped me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mike's gaze flicked between Emily and the crowd, searching for an escape. "That's what I thought," Emily said, her words slicing through the tension. "You don't have an answer because there isn't one. You stopped me because you could, because you assumed I wouldn't push back. But you assumed wrong." The crowd stirred, some murmuring words of agreement while others looked on in stunned silence. "Look, I'm not here to argue with you," Mike said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "Then stop arguing," Emily shot back. "Do your job properly, or admit you made a mistake." Mike's face turned a deeper shade of red, his frustration palpable. His hand hovered near his belt, not quite reaching for his gun, but close enough to remind everyone it was there. "Is this how you handle all your stops?" Emily pressed. "With a hand on your weapon and a flimsy excuse about protocol? Do you stop every woman walking down the street? Or was today special?" More murmurs rippled through the crowd. That's not fair, Mike snapped. I stop anyone who looks suspicious. And what looks suspicious to you? Emily asked, her tone razor sharp. A woman carrying a bag? Or just a woman who looks like me? The crowd stirred louder this time, a few voices calling out in agreement. She's right, one man said. Enough, Mike barked, his voice cracking slightly. Enough? Emily repeated, her tone calm but firm. You're the one who started this, and now you can't handle the heat? Mike's hand fell from his belt as he straightened, his jaw clenched tight. This isn't over, he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. For your sake, Emily said, her voice carrying effortlessly over the murmurs of the crowd. It should be, because this little display of yours isn't going to end well for you. The crowd shifted again, their whispers and stares adding to the weight pressing down on Mike. Some began questioning aloud whether this was necessary. Why is he still holding her up? A woman asked. This doesn't seem right, another muttered. Mike's gaze darted toward the growing sea of phones, the realization of the situation sinking in. Emily stood tall, her calm yet commanding presence making it impossible for him to regain control. You wanted attention, Emily said, her voice low but piercing. Well, now you've got it. Mike's lips pressed into a thin line as he glanced at the bag he'd already rifled through. I'm just following orders, he muttered under his breath. Emily let out a quiet laugh, devoid of humor. Orders to do what exactly? Target people who don't look like you? Is that part of the training manual now? The crowd murmured louder, their voices swelling with agreement. Mike took a step back, his authority visibly crumbling. The tension in the air was palpable as Emily took a deliberate step forward, her gaze locked onto his. This isn't about protocol, she said, her voice steady. This is about power. And right now, you're losing it. The murmurs grew into a low rumble, the crowd sensing a shift. Phones were now raised higher, capturing every moment as the balance of power tipped further in Emily's favor. The crowd around Emily and Mike thickened as more people slowed to watch, their curiosity piqued by the growing tension. Phones were raised, cameras rolling to capture every second. Whispers and murmurs rose like a wave, breaking into audible fragments of opinion. This doesn't look right, a young woman near the front said, her phone steady as she filmed. Why is he bothering her? She's not doing anything. But why not just let him check the bag and move on? Another voice countered from the back. A man in a suit shook his head. She's probably hiding something. If she's innocent, what's the problem? Emily stood her ground, her eyes locked on Mike as the scattered comments from the crowd swirled around her. The officer's jaw tightened, his expression shifting between frustration and unease. I'm just doing my job, Mike said loudly, as if addressing both Emily and the crowd. This is standard procedure. Standard for who? A voice from the crowd shot back. A middle-aged woman holding a toddler on her hip looked up from her phone. Because it sure looks like you're picking on her for no reason. Mike's gaze darted toward the woman briefly before returning to Emily. I'm not here to debate, he said, his tone clipped. I have a job to do. Then do it properly, Emily replied, her voice steady and deliberate. Because all I see is you reaching for excuses, not evidence. Her words rippled through the crowd, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. She's being difficult on purpose, the man in the suit muttered, shaking his head again. If she's so innocent, why not just cooperate? Emily turned her head slightly toward him, her tone cutting without raising her voice. Cooperate with what? An accusation based on nothing? If you were in my shoes, would you hand over your dignity so easily? The man faltered, glancing around as if seeking support for his argument. The young woman with the phone stepped forward slightly, her voice rising. She's right. He's just throwing his weight around because he thinks no one will call him out. Mike's face flushed as he straightened his posture. He pointed at Emily's bag on the ground. Let's be clear, he said sharply. I'm not throwing my weight around. I have every right to check that bag. And you've already checked it, Emily shot back, her tone firm but calm. So what exactly are you looking for now? Mike hesitated, his gaze shifting momentarily. I'm ensuring public safety, Emily arched an eyebrow. Public safety from a book, a laptop, and a water bottle? Or is it just safer to assume I'm a threat because of how I look? The tension in the air thickened as a few people in the crowd murmured in agreement while others exchanged uncertain glances. Stop making this about race, someone called from the side. The officer's just doing his job. Emily turned her gaze toward the voice, her expression calm but unwavering. If that's the job, stopping people without cause, searching their belongings, and refusing to explain why, then maybe the job is the problem. The crowd stirred uneasily, a mix of agreement and skepticism rippling through it. "Ma'am," Mike interjected, his tone sharp and defensive, "you're escalating this." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm escalating nothing. I'm standing my ground while you scramble to justify your actions. That's on you, not me." The crowd shifted again, their whispers growing louder. "She's got a point," someone muttered. "Just let it go," another voice said. "He's not going to back down, and she's not giving in." Mike's irritation was now visible, his composure unraveling as the weight of the crowd's scrutiny bore down on him. "Listen," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "I'm following protocol. This is about ensuring everyone's safety." "Everyone?" Emily's voice cut through his attempt to regain control. "Because it looks like you're only concerned about me. I haven't seen you stop anyone else here tonight." The crowd murmured louder now, a few voices calling out in agreement. "Yeah, why just her?" one man asked. Mike's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said, his voice hard. Emily took a deliberate step forward, her gaze steady. "Then who do you explain yourself to, officer?" "Because these people seem interested in hearing an answer." The crowd stirred again, the tide of opinion shifting visibly in Emily's favor. "Why is he so defensive?" a young man near the front asked. "Because he knows she's right," someone replied. Mike's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, not quite touching his weapon, but close enough to be noticed. The movement didn't go unnoticed by the crowd, and a murmur of unease rippled through them. "Seriously?" Emily said, her voice sharp now. "You're reaching for your gun because what? I'm standing here asking questions? That's not what I'm doing," Mike snapped, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. "Then stop making it look that way," Emily countered. "Because these people are watching, and they're not going to let you twist this into something it's not." The crowd grew louder, a few voices rising in anger. "Why is he acting like that?" a woman asked. "Because he knows he's losing control," someone else replied. Mike turned toward the crowd, his face flushed. "You don't understand what it's like out here," he said, his voice strained. "We deal with criminals every day. We can't take chances." The words hung in the air for a moment before Emily broke the silence. "Criminals like me?" she asked, her tone icy. "Walking down the street with a bag full of books?" The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs. "He's digging himself deeper," someone said. Mike's frustration boiled over. "This isn't about race," he said loudly. "Then what is it about?" Emily demanded. "Because you've yet to give a real reason for stopping me. And judging by the looks on their faces, nobody here is buying it." The murmurs turned into open questioning, the crowd pushing closer. Phones were raised higher, their cameras capturing every expression, every word. "Explain yourself," someone shouted. "Yeah, what's your excuse?" Another voice joined in. Mike's confidence faltered as he looked around, the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on him. Emily, calm and unshaken, watched him with unrelenting focus. "Check the bag again if you need to," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "But we both know you won't find anything except more reasons to regret this." Mike's hesitation stretched long enough for the crowd to press in further, their divided opinions now overshadowed by collective curiosity about how this would end. Mike crouched down beside Emily's bag, his movements deliberate but laced with tension. The weight of the crowd's eyes and cameras bore down on him as he unzipped the leather bag. His hands moved briskly, almost impatiently, as if rushing would somehow justify his actions. Inside, the contents were arranged with military precision: a stainless steel water bottle, a sleek laptop, and a neatly folded hardcover book. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing over the spine of the book before pulling it out. The title, bold and unmistakable, read, "Leadership Under Pressure, a Navy SEAL's Guide to Resilience and Excellence." Mike blinked, caught off guard. He flipped the book over, scanning the back cover. There, beneath a professional photograph of Emily in uniform, was her name and rank prominently displayed. The crowd began murmuring audibly, and a ripple of laughter broke through as someone exclaimed, "Wait, she wrote that?" Emily crossed her arms, watching Mike's reaction with measured calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rising noise. Mike stiffened, shoving the book back into the bag with more force than necessary. "What's this supposed to prove?" he snapped, though the redness creeping up his neck betrayed his discomfort. Emily's lips curved into a faint smile. "That depends," she said smoothly. "Do you want me to autograph it for you, or are you just planning to keep digging for a problem that isn't there?" The crowd erupted into laughter, the tension momentarily broken by her sharp wit. Phones zoomed in on Mike's flushed face as he struggled to regain control. "That's enough!" he barked, his voice louder now, trying to drown out the growing amusement around him. "Enough of what?" Emily asked, tilting her head slightly. "Enough of me cooperating? Enough of me letting you go through my things in front of all these people? Or enough of everyone seeing that you stopped me for absolutely no reason?" Mike's jaw clenched. Ignoring her, he reached for the laptop next. He inspected it briefly, opening and closing the lid with unnecessary force, clearly hoping to find something incriminating. When nothing materialized, he set it aside with a huff and moved to the final item, a leather-bound notebook. He flipped it open, skimming the neatly written pages. The journal was filled with reflections and strategies Emily had documented during her time in service. As he read, his face hardened, his expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Anything illegal in there?" Emily asked, her tone light but sharp enough to cut. Mike slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the bag. Standing up abruptly, he glared at her. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back as if retreating from a losing battle. Emily didn't move. Her arms remained crossed, her gaze unflinching. "Not so fast," she said, her voice low but commanding. Mike froze, his eyes narrowing. "What now?" Emily took a small step forward, her movements deliberate. "You stopped me," she began, her tone steady. "Searched my belongings, accused me of fitting some vague description, and now you're walking away without a word of explanation?" The crowd, emboldened by her challenge, voiced their agreement. "Yeah, explain yourself," someone shouted. "You can't just harass someone and leave," another added. Mike's face reddened further, his earlier confidence completely eroded. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You owe these people the truth," Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "What's the description I supposedly fit? Or is that just code for black woman minding her own business?" The crowd gasped, a mix of shock and indignation rippling through them. Mike's hands balled into fists at his sides, his composure slipping further. "That's not what this is," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then say what it is," Emily pressed. "Because right now, it looks like you're making this up as you go." The crowd erupted again, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Mike glanced around, his eyes darting to the sea of phones capturing every moment. "This is harassment," someone called out. "You should be ashamed," another voice added. Mike took a step back, raising his hand slightly as if to defend himself. "I was doing my job," he said, though his tone sounded more like a plea than a statement. "No," Emily corrected him, her voice firm. "Your job is to protect and serve. What you did here today was neither." The crowd cheered, their support for Emily swelling with every word she spoke. Mike turned back to her, his frustration boiling over. "Look," he said through gritted teeth, "I'm trying to de-escalate this." Emily raised an eyebrow. "De-escalate?" she echoed. "You created this situation, officer. Now you want to act like the victim?" The laughter that followed from the crowd was loud and cutting. Mike looked visibly rattled, his hands twitching as he struggled to maintain control. "Explain yourself!" someone shouted again, their voice rising above the noise. Emily took another step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "You have two choices," she said calmly. "You can explain to everyone here why you stopped me, or you can continue to dig yourself into a deeper hole." Mike's breath hitched, the reality of his situation sinking in. The cameras, the crowd, and Emily's unwavering presence left him nowhere to hide. "I don't owe you anything," he said finally, though his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "You owe me an apology and you owe these people an explanation. Because if you think you can walk away from this without consequences, you're sorely mistaken." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices demanding accountability. Mike glanced around helplessly, the walls of public scrutiny closing in. Emily's calm, commanding voice cut through the chaos once more. "So what's it going to be, officer? Are you going to do the right thing, or are you going to let these cameras tell the story for you?" Mike didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes, and the crowd's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Emily took a deliberate step forward, her voice calm yet sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Tell me something, officer," she began, her eyes locking onto Mike's. "Do you honestly believe this is about public safety? Or is this about you flexing your authority because you assumed I wouldn't push back?" Mike stiffened, visibly thrown off by her directness. "You fit the description of a suspect," he shot back, his words quick and defensive. "Fit the description?" Emily repeated, her tone incredulous. "What's the description exactly? Let me guess. Black and female?" The crowd erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs. Several people nodded in agreement, while others whispered among themselves. "That's not what I said," Mike replied hastily, his face reddening. "Then say what you mean," Emily pressed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you stopped me for no reason other than the way I look." The crowd began to shift, their murmurs growing louder. "She's right," someone called out. "What kind of description is that?" another voice added, frustration evident. Mike's composure cracked further. He glanced around at the sea of faces, the raised phones capturing his every move. "This isn't about race," he snapped, his tone edging toward desperation. "Then what is it about?" Emily countered, taking another step forward. "Because you've given me no reason, no evidence, nothing but vague accusations and power plays." The crowd's support for Emily grew more vocal. "Yeah, what's your reason?" a man shouted from the back. "Leave her alone," another voice chimed in. Mike's jaw clenched, his frustration now visible in the tightness of his posture. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you," he said, his voice strained. "Of course not," Emily said, her tone razor-sharp. "Because you know you don't have an argument. You can't defend what you've done here, and you can't justify it to anyone watching." The crowd's energy shifted further in Emily's favor. A woman near the front raised her phone higher, her voice loud and clear. "This is what they do. They pick on people who they think can't fight back." Mike turned toward the woman, his face flushed with anger. "I'm doing my job," he said through gritted teeth. "No," Emily interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Your job is to protect and serve. But here you are, targeting me without cause, hoping I'll just accept it. Well, I won't." The crowd cheered at her words, a few people clapping in support. Mike's frustration boiled over. "You're escalating this situation," he accused, pointing a finger at her. "Am I?" Emily shot back, unfazed. "Or are you realizing that you don't have control anymore? Because it sure looks like you're losing it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, further shaking Mike's fragile authority. "I told you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. That's why I stopped you." Emily crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "So, let me get this straight. You've stopped me, searched my bag, found nothing, and yet you're still clinging to this so-called description. Tell me, officer, do all your descriptions boil down to profiling, or am I just lucky today?" The crowd roared in agreement, their voices growing louder and more confident. Mike's hand hovered near his belt, his movements stiff and defensive. "I'm not profiling you," he said, though his words carried no weight. "Then explain it," Emily challenged. "Explain to everyone here why I was stopped. Because they're all waiting, and so am I." The silence that followed was deafening. Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. "She's got him," someone in the crowd said, their tone triumphant. "Answer her!" another shouted. Mike's eyes darted toward the phones pointed at him, their lenses capturing every crack in his facade. "I don't owe you an explanation," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. "That's where you're wrong," she said firmly. "You owe me an explanation. You owe everyone here an explanation. And if you can't give one, maybe it's time you admit you made a mistake." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices echoing through the street. Mike's hands twitched at his sides, his frustration palpable. "I didn't make a mistake," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Then prove it," Emily said, her voice unwavering. "Because right now, all I see is a man trying to cover up his own prejudice with excuses." The crowd's cheers grew louder, their energy amplifying as Emily stood her ground. Let her go, someone yelled. Apologize, another demanded. Mike looked around, his face pale, his confidence crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Emily's calm, commanding presence left him no room to maneuver. You can end this right now, she said, her tone softer but no less powerful. Own up to what you've done, and we'll all move on. Or you can keep digging yourself deeper. Your call. The crowd waited, their anticipation palpable. Mike hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. The power had shifted completely, and everyone could see it. Emily didn't flinch, her gaze locked on his. So, officer, she said, her voice carrying over the noise, what's it going to be? Mike's silence was deafening, his authority now hanging by a thread as the crowd pressed in closer, their voices demanding accountability. The tension in the air thickened as the crowd pressed in closer, their voices growing bolder. Then, from somewhere near the front, a voice rang out with cutting clarity. I know this guy, a middle-aged man shouted, his tone sharp and accusatory. Heads turned toward him as he stepped forward, pointing directly at Mike. He pulled the same stunt on my nephew last year. Stopped him for no reason. Said he looked suspicious. Sound familiar, officer? The crowd rippled with murmurs, their collective gaze snapping back to Mike. The officer's face flushed red, his jaw tightening as he stared at the man. That's not true, Mike said, his voice defensive, though lacking conviction. Oh, it's true, the man shot back, his tone rising. And you know it. You tried to intimidate him, just like you're doing now. Only difference is this time, people are watching. The murmurs turned into outright agreement from parts of the crowd. Sounds like a pattern, someone called out. Emily seized the moment, stepping forward to confront Mike. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that cut through the growing noise. This isn't the first time, is it? She asked, her gaze boring into him. How many people have you done this to? How many times have you gotten away with it because no one was watching? Mike stiffened, his mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. That's what I thought, Emily said, her tone laced with quiet authority. You assumed today would be no different. You assumed I'd stay quiet, that I'd comply, that I'd let you walk all over me like you've done to others. But you were wrong. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices swelling into a chorus of support. Mike raised a hand, trying to regain control. This is getting out of hand, he said, his tone sharper now. Everyone needs to back up and calm down. Out of hand? Emily retorted, her voice rising. You made it this way, officer. You stopped me for no reason. You rifled through my belongings in front of all these people. And now, when the truth comes out, you want to act like you're the victim? Laughter rippled through the crowd, cutting through Mike's attempt to regain authority. That's not what I'm doing, he said quickly, his words tumbling over themselves. Then what are you doing? Emily pressed, her tone relentless. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're trying to cover your tracks. But it's too late, officer. Everyone here sees you for what you are. The man from earlier spoke up again, his voice cutting through the chaos. He's been doing this for years, always targeting minorities. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. Mike spun toward him, his frustration boiling over. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, though his voice cracked under the pressure. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, the man fired back. And so does everyone else here. The crowd cheered, their voices growing louder with every passing second. Mike turned back to Emily, his composure now completely unraveling. I was just doing my job, he said. Though the words sounded hollow, Emily didn't let up. Your job? She echoed. To harass people, to profile them based on nothing but your own prejudice? Is that what you're calling doing your job now? Mike's lips pressed into a thin line as he struggled to find a response. Answer her, someone in the crowd shouted. Yeah, what's your excuse this time? Another added. Emily stepped even closer, her presence commanding. You can't hide behind protocol anymore, she said. Not when the truth is staring everyone in the face. You stopped me because you thought you could get away with it. But you didn't count on this, did you? The officer's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. The crowd's energy had shifted entirely against him, their chants and shouts building into a wall of sound. Why don't you admit it? Emily continued, her voice cutting through the noise. Admit that you stopped me because of what I look like. Admit that you thought no one would care. Because that's the truth, isn't it? Mike's face turned red, his hands twitching at his sides. I didn't profile you, he said weakly. I was following a lead. A lead? Emily shot back, her tone filled with disbelief. A lead that just so happened to match my race and gender? That's your defense? The crowd erupted again, their outrage palpable. That's not a lead, someone called out. That's a lame excuse. Mike's frustration boiled over, and he took a step forward, his finger pointing at Emily. You don't know what it's like out here, he said, his voice trembling with anger. We deal with dangerous people every day. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing ourselves. Emily didn't flinch. Dangerous people? She repeated, her voice filled with quiet fury. You mean people like me? Walking down the street with a book in their bag? That's your idea of dangerous? Mike hesitated, the weight of her words and the crowd's reaction bearing down on him. You don't get to justify this, Emily said, her voice rising. Not when your actions speak louder than your excuses. You stopped me because of bias, plain and simple. And now, everyone here knows it. The crowd cheered loudly, their support for Emily unwavering. Mike looked around, his face pale, his authority shattered. You've been doing this for years, the man from earlier said again, his tone firm. But not today. Today you're getting called out. Emily stepped back slightly, gesturing toward the crowd. These people aren't going anywhere, she said. And neither am I. So you can either come clean or you can keep digging yourself into a deeper hole. Your choice. Mike didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than words, and the crowd's voices grew louder, their demand for accountability ringing through the street. The crackle of a police radio broke through the escalating tension. Another officer, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, pushed through the crowd. Her badge gleamed under the streetlights as she raised her hands to calm the restless onlookers. All right, everyone, step back, she commanded, her tone authoritative. We need space to address the situation. The crowd barely budged, their phones still recording, their distrust evident. The woman approached Mike, her voice low but firm. What's going on here? Officer Rachel Davis glanced at Emily, then at the growing crowd. Her brows furrowed as she scanned the scene, clearly trying to gauge the situation. I've got it under control, Mike muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Rachel's gaze lingered on him for a beat before shifting back to Emily. Ma'am, I'm Officer Davis, she began, her tone measured but firm. We're just conducting routine protocol. Please cooperate so we can resolve this quickly. Emily's lips tightened into a thin line. She crossed her arms, her posture unyielding. Routine protocol? She repeated, her voice sharp. Is it routine to stop someone without cause? To search their belongings and humiliate them in public? Rachel's expression flickered with hesitation. This isn't about humiliation, she said. It's about ensuring public safety. Emily's eyes narrowed. Public safety? She shot back. Is that what you call it when you target someone based on how they look? Because if this is your version of protocol, it's broken. The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers swelling into audible support. She's right, someone shouted. Rachel's composure faltered. She glanced at Mike, who stood silently, his jaw clenched, then back at Emily. Ma'am, let's not escalate this further, Rachel said, though her tone lacked its initial confidence. Escalate? Emily said, her voice rising just enough to be heard clearly by the crowd. Your officer escalated this the moment he stopped me without a shred of evidence. And now you're here defending him, calling it protocol. So tell me, Officer Davis, is it protocol to harass people who look like me? Or does that only happen when no one's watching? The crowd erupted into cheers and clapping, their voices rising in agreement. Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced at Mike again, as if silently asking for backup, but his rigid stance offered no support. This isn't about harassment, Rachel finally said, her tone defensive. We're just doing our job. Your job? Emily countered, her tone cold and cutting. Your job is to serve and protect, not to single people out, not to intimidate them, and definitely not to try and justify it with some vague excuse about public safety. Rachel's face flushed. That's not what's happening here. Then what is happening? Emily pressed, taking a step forward. Because I've asked, and I still haven't gotten an answer. Why was I stopped? Why was my bag searched? What's the real reason? The crowd grew louder, their demands for answers echoing through the street. Yeah, explain it, someone yelled. Rachel raised her hands in an attempt to calm them. Everyone, please, we're trying to handle this professionally. Professionally? Emily cut in. If this is what you call professional, I'd hate to see what unprofessional looks like. The crowd laughed and clapped, their energy emboldening Emily further. This isn't a laughing matter, Rachel snapped, her voice rising. You're right, Emily said, her tone icy. It's not. It's a matter of accountability. And right now, neither of you is owning up to what you've done. Rachel's frustration was evident. She turned back to Mike, her voice dropping, but still audible to those closest. Why did you stop her? Mike's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might speak. But then he shook his head, muttering, She fit the description. Rachel winced at his response, glancing at the crowd, and then back at Emily. Look, she said, trying to regain control. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Let's not blow this out of proportion. Emily's eyes blazed with indignation. Blow this out of proportion? She repeated, her voice rising. You think being stopped, searched, and humiliated is something minor? Would it still be a misunderstanding if it were you standing here, being treated like a criminal for no reason? Rachel's mouth opened, but no words came out. The crowd erupted again, their anger directed squarely at the officers. Answer her, someone shouted. This is unacceptable, another voice added. Rachel raised her hands again, her voice strained. We're trying to de-escalate. Then start with accountability, Emily snapped. Admit this was wrong. Admit that you stopped me because of bias and nothing else. Rachel hesitated, her confidence slipping further under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. Mike remained silent, his face a mask of frustration and embarrassment. The energy of the crowd shifted as people began sharing videos in real time. A woman near the front held up her phone, her voice loud and clear. This is going viral, she said. Everyone's going to see how you two are handling this. Another person chimed in. Yeah, let the world see what protocol looks like. Rachel's eyes darted to the phones, her discomfort growing. We don't want this to escalate further, she said again, her tone almost pleading. Emily's voice cut through the noise, calm but unrelenting. Then stop hiding behind excuses. Own up to what you've done, and maybe this ends here. Rachel glanced at Mike, her expression a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. But Mike remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. The crowd's chants grew louder, their calls for accountability echoing through the street. Rachel looked back at Emily, her resolve faltering completely. Let's just regroup, she muttered to Mike, stepping back slightly. Emily didn't move, her voice carrying over the growing noise. This isn't going away, she said, her tone steady and commanding. Not until you face what you've done. The crowd cheered in agreement, their phones raised higher, their voices growing louder. Rachel and Mike exchanged a brief, helpless glance before stepping back, the weight of public scrutiny overwhelming them. Mike's hand drifted closer to the grip of his holstered weapon, the movement slow but deliberate. The crowd noticed instantly, and a wave of unease rippled through them. A few people gasped, their phones capturing every second of the growing tension. Emily saw it too, but she didn't flinch. Her voice, steady and commanding, rang out over the murmurs. Everyone, keep your cameras up. Record everything. The crowd responded without hesitation. Phones were held higher, lenses focused on Mike's every move. Some shouted in alarm. What's he doing? A man yelled. Why is his hand on his gun? A woman demanded, her voice rising in pitch. Mike's face tightened, and he shot a glare at Emily. Ma'am, he said through gritted teeth, his tone a mix of warning and frustration. Step back. Emily didn't budge. I'm standing exactly where I need to be, she replied, her voice firm but calm. And if you think reaching for your weapon is going to intimidate me, you're wrong. The crowd's energy shifted from fear to anger. Put your hand down, someone shouted. She's unarmed, another yelled. Mike's fingers hovered just above the holster, his composure cracking under the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. I'm asking you one last time, he barked, his voice strained. Step back. And I'm asking you, Emily countered, her voice rising slightly. What threat do I pose that justifies you reaching for your gun? Because everyone here sees what's happening, and no one's buying it. Her words hit their mark, and the crowd erupted in agreement. She's right, a man called out. This is insane, another shouted. Mike's hand twitched, but he stopped short of fully gripping the weapon. His gaze flicked nervously to the crowd, their phones raised, their voices growing louder. Emily took a deliberate step closer, her tone cutting through the noise like a blade. You want to talk about safety, officer? Tell me, who here feels safer with your hand on that gun? Because it's certainly not me. The crowd cheered, their support emboldening Emily further. Put it down, a woman near the front yelled. This is going too far, someone else added. Mike's chest rose and fell rapidly as he struggled to maintain control. He glanced at Rachel, who stood frozen, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. Emily turned her gaze briefly to the crowd. Keep recording, she said, her voice steady. No one stops until we have the truth. Mike's frustration boiled over. He pointed a finger at Emily, his voice cracking under the pressure. You're escalating this situation. No, officer, Emily shot back, her voice sharp. You escalated it the moment you reached for your weapon. Don't try to put that on me. The crowd roared in agreement, their anger now squarely directed at Mike. What's wrong with you? A man yelled. She hasn't done anything, a woman added. Rachel finally stepped forward, her hands raised as if to calm the storm. Everyone, please, she pleaded. We need to de-escalate. Then start with him, Emily fired back, pointing directly at Mike. Tell him to take his hand off that gun and admit he's in the wrong. Rachel hesitated, glancing nervously between Mike and Emily. The crowd's chants of "put it down" grew louder, the pressure mounting. Mike finally let out a heavy breath and lowered his hand, stepping back slightly. The tension in the air remained thick, but the threat of immediate violence dissipated. Good, Emily said, her tone icy. Now, how about you explain why you thought that was necessary? Mike didn't respond. His gaze darted to the crowd, their phones capturing his every move, their voices growing louder with each passing second. Apologize, someone shouted. Explain yourself, another added. Emily took another step forward, her presence commanding. You can't hide behind protocol anymore, officer, she said, her voice unwavering. Everyone here saw what you just did, and everyone here is going to hold you accountable for it. Mike clenched his fists at his sides, his face pale. I was just trying to maintain control, he muttered, though his words were barely audible over the noise. Troll? Emily repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. You think threatening me with your weapon is control? That's not control. It's cowardice. The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers growing louder. Enough! Mike shouted, his voice cracking. This is over! No, officer, Emily said firmly. It's not. It's far from over. Rachel stepped in again, her voice strained. We need to defuse this situation, she said, though the crowd wasn't listening. Emily's eyes burned with resolve as she addressed Rachel directly. Then start by holding him accountable, because if you don't, this crowd will. Rachel hesitated, her authority slipping further with every second. The crowd's chants grew louder, their phones raised higher. Mike looked around, his desperation visible. I'm done here, he muttered, turning toward the cruiser. You don't get to walk away, Emily shouted, her voice carrying over the noise. Not after this. Not after you put everyone here at risk with your reckless actions. The crowd surged forward, their voices demanding justice. Rachel raised her hands, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The tide had turned, and the power was no longer in the officer's hands. Emily stood tall, her gaze unflinching. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. This is about every person who's ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated by people like you. And we're not letting it happen anymore. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the street. Mike and Rachel exchanged helpless glances, their authority completely dismantled. Emily's calm, commanding presence left no room for doubt. She had won the moment, and everyone watching knew it. The murmurs of the crowd grew into a rhythmic chant, their voices rising in unison. Justice now. Justice now. The simple demand reverberated through the street, drawing even more attention. Bystanders paused, their curiosity pulling them toward the growing commotion. Emily stood her ground, her gaze locked on Mike and Rachel as the energy around her transformed. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was becoming a movement. "We're not leaving until we get answers," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "That's right," another voice echoed. "Hold them accountable!" Mike shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from one face to another, the weight of the crowd's outrage pressing down on him. Rachel raised her hands, her attempt to calm the crowd swallowed by their chants. "This isn't helping," Rachel called out, her voice strained. "It's helping more than you are," Emily shot back, her voice cutting through the noise. "These people are here because they see the truth, and they're not letting you sweep this under the rug." Phones continued to record from every angle, capturing every word, every tense movement. The power of the moment wasn't lost on the crowd. They knew they were witnessing something important, and they weren't going to let it go unnoticed. From the corner of the street, a van with a local news logo screeched to a stop. A reporter jumped out, microphone in hand, her cameraman close behind. She pushed through the throng, her voice rising over the chanting. "What's happening here?" she asked, directing her question to the crowd. "Police harassment," a man shouted. "They stopped her for no reason," another woman added. The reporter turned her attention to Emily, who stood tall in the center of the chaos. "Ma'am, can you tell us what's going on?" Emily didn't hesitate. "This officer," she said, pointing at Mike, "stopped me without cause, searched my belongings, and reached for his weapon when I questioned him. And now he can't explain why." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices amplifying her words. The reporter turned to Mike, her microphone thrust toward him. "Officer, do you have a response to these allegations?" Mike's face turned red, and he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He glanced at Rachel, who avoided his gaze, her discomfort evident. "You can't even defend yourself," Emily said, her voice steady but cutting, "because you know what you did was wrong." The reporter turned back to Emily. "What do you want to see happen?" Emily's expression hardened. "I want accountability," she said firmly. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated like this and didn't have a crowd to back them up. This has to stop." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants shifting again. "Stop the bias! Stop the bias!" Rachel stepped forward, her hands raised. "We're not going to ignore this," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "This will be reviewed." "Reviewed?" Emily repeated, her voice filled with incredulity. "That's not good enough. We don't need another empty promise of an internal investigation. We need real consequences, and we need them now." The crowd roared in agreement, their energy unwavering. The reporter moved through the crowd, gathering more statements. A woman holding her young child spoke into the microphone, her voice shaking with anger. "I've seen this happen too many times. My brother was stopped last year for fitting the description. They humiliated him, and nothing happened to the officers. This has to change." More voices joined in, recounting their own stories of racial profiling and police misconduct. Each one fueled the crowd's determination, their chants growing louder, more focused. "Enough is enough," a man shouted, his fist raised high. The reporter's camera panned over the crowd, capturing the raw emotion, the unfiltered demand for justice. "This is bigger than one incident," she said into her microphone, addressing her viewers. "It's clear that this community is calling for systemic change." Mike and Rachel stood at the edge of the crowd, their authority crumbling under the relentless pressure. Rachel tried again to regain control. "Please, everyone, let's work through this the right way." "The right way?" Emily cut her off, her voice rising. "The right way would have been not stopping me in the first place. The right way would have been treating me with respect, not as a suspect. Don't talk to us about the right way when your actions have been anything but." The crowd cheered louder, their chants now drowning out any attempt at rebuttal. "Justice now! Justice now!" The reporter returned to Emily. "What's next for you?" Emily paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Next," she said, her voice steady, "we make sure this doesn't get buried. Every person here has a phone, and every person here has a voice. We use them. We share this story until there's no way they can ignore it." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy reaching a fever pitch. Phones were already buzzing with activity as videos uploaded in real time, spreading across social media like wildfire. Rachel turned to Mike, her voice low but tense. "We need to leave," she said. Mike didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground. The weight of the moment had rendered him silent, his authority shattered. As the chants continued, the reporter ended her live segment, the camera lingering on Emily one last time. "This is no longer just about one woman and one officer," she said into the microphone. "This is about a community demanding justice, accountability, and change." Emily turned back to the crowd, her voice cutting through the noise. "This doesn't end here," she said. "Today is just the beginning." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing down the street as the movement gained momentum. Emily stepped forward, her voice rising above the chants and shouts. "Listen to me!" she called out, her tone firm yet steady, commanding immediate attention. The crowd hushed slightly, their focus snapping to her as she stood in the center of the storm. "This isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "Today is about everyone who's ever been stopped, questioned, or mistreated because of the way they look. It's about the countless voices that were silenced because no one was there to listen. Well, today, we're all here, and we're not staying silent." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices filled with support and determination. "That's right!" someone yelled. Mike's face was pale, the authority he once wielded reduced to a fragile shell. He glanced at Rachel, who stood to the side, her lips pressed into a tight line. The chants of the crowd grew louder, and the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Finally, with visible hesitation, Mike raised his hand slightly, signaling for attention. His voice was barely audible as he spoke. I apologize," he said, his tone hollow, his words strained. "I misjudged the situation." Emily's eyes narrowed, and she turned to face him fully. "Misjudged?" she repeated, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "That's all you have to say? That you made a mistake? After you humiliated me in public? After you reached for your weapon? After you put your bias on full display for everyone here to see?" Mike opened his mouth to respond, but Emily didn't give him the chance. "A weak apology isn't enough," she continued, her tone sharp and unyielding. "You don't just owe me an apology, you owe every single person here an explanation. Why did you stop me? Why did you treat me like a threat? And why do you think you can get away with it?" The crowd cheered in agreement, their chants growing louder. "Explain yourself!" someone shouted. Mike shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Emily and the crowd. I thought you fit a description," he stammered, his voice faltering. Emily took a step closer, her expression unflinching. "A description?" she echoed, her voice filled with disbelief. "What description? Because I've asked you that question over and over, and you still haven't answered. Was it my skin color? My gender? Or just the fact that I dared to walk down the street minding my own business?" The crowd erupted again, their anger directed squarely at Mike. "Answer her!" they demanded. Mike's shoulders sagged, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I made a mistake," he repeated weakly, his voice barely audible. Emily shook her head. "A mistake isn't pulling someone over for a broken taillight," she said, her tone cold and unforgiving. "A mistake isn't losing your way on patrol. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. You chose to stop me, you chose to search me, and you chose to treat me as less than human. That's not a mistake, officer. That's a pattern. And it's one we're not tolerating anymore." The crowd roared their agreement, their voices a tidal wave of support. Rachel stepped forward, her hands raised in an attempt to diffuse the situation. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she began, her voice strained. "Conclusions?" Emily shot back, turning to face Rachel. "There are no conclusions to jump to. Everything we need to know is right here." She gestured toward the crowd and the dozens of phones recording every moment. "The proof is in his actions, and his silence only confirms it." Rachel hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to respond. Emily turned back to Mike, her voice steady but unrelenting. "So, what happens now, officer?" Do you think you can just walk away from this? Pretend it never happened? Because I'm telling you right now, that's not going to happen. Mike looked around, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. What do you want from me? He asked weakly. Emily's tone turned icy. I want accountability, she said. Not excuses, not apologies, and certainly not empty promises. I want you to own up to what you did and face the consequences of your actions. Because that's what justice looks like. The crowd erupted again, their voices chanting, Accountability! Accountability! Mike's head hung slightly as he avoided the piercing gazes of the crowd. Rachel stepped closer to him, whispering something inaudible, but he didn't respond. Emily addressed the crowd once more, her voice carrying over the noise. This doesn't stop here, she said. This isn't just about one officer and one incident. This is about a system that allows people like him to abuse their power without consequence. And if we want change, we have to demand it. The crowd's cheers were deafening, their chants echoing down the street. Emily turned back to Mike, her expression firm. This is your chance, she said. Take responsibility. Show everyone here that you understand what you did and that you're willing to change. Or don't, and let the world see exactly who you are. Mike looked up at her, his expression one of defeat. I'll file a report on myself, he muttered, the words weak and unconvincing. The crowd roared their agreement, their chants of justice now ringing through the night. Emily stood tall, her presence commanding, as the power dynamic had completely shifted. Mike and Rachel were no longer the ones in control. Emily and the crowd had taken that from them, and they weren't giving it back. Before the crowd could settle, a man emerged from the throng, his presence immediately commanding attention. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, his tone was firm, yet resolute as he addressed the crowd. My name is Marcus Wright, he said, raising his voice just enough to cut through the noise. I'm a civil rights attorney, and what I've witnessed here today is unacceptable. Let me be clear, this isn't just a lapse in judgment. This is a clear abuse of power, and it will not go unanswered. The crowd cheered loudly, their chants of accountability briefly pausing as Marcus's words landed with force. Marcus turned to Emily, his gaze steady. You've handled yourself with remarkable strength and composure, he said. Now, it's time to take this further. If you're willing, I'll make sure this doesn't just end here on this street. Emily nodded without hesitation. I'm with you, she said firmly. Marcus pivoted back toward Mike and Rachel, his demeanor sharp as a blade. Officer Thompson, he began, his voice carrying a weight of authority. You've crossed every line of ethical conduct today. Not only did you target and harass this woman without cause, but you've exposed a systemic issue that can no longer be ignored. Mike shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the ground. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Marcus pressed, his tone challenging. I've already apologized, Mike stammered, his words barely audible. Marcus's response was swift. An apology isn't enough. An apology doesn't erase the fear you instilled or the harm you caused. An apology doesn't change the fact that your actions were fueled by prejudice. The crowd erupted into cheers of agreement. Rachel attempted to interject. We'll conduct a thorough investigation, she said hastily. Marcus turned his attention to her. An internal investigation? He asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. We all know how those end. No accountability, no change. Just a quiet shuffle back into uniform. The crowd booed loudly, their frustration palpable. This time will be different, Marcus continued, his voice rising. We have witnesses, we have videos, and we have a community demanding justice. He gestured toward the crowd, their phones still recording, their determination unwavering. The reality of the situation began to weigh heavily on Mike. His posture slumped, his earlier arrogance completely gone. I was following protocol, he muttered weakly. Marcus's tone turned icy. Protocol? Show me where in your protocol it says to target someone based on their appearance. Show me where it says to search their belongings without cause. Show me where it says to reach for your weapon when there's no threat. Mike didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. That's what I thought, Marcus said, his voice cutting. Your so-called protocol isn't just flawed, it's dangerous, and it's going to be exposed for what it is. The crowd roared, their voices filled with resolve. Within moments, the buzz of phones vibrating and notifications pinging spread through the crowd. Social media platforms were already lighting up with videos of the encounter. Hashtags like "Or Justice for Emily" and "Or Hold Them Accountable" began trending, amplifying the story far beyond the street. Rachel's radio crackled to life, and she stepped aside to answer, her expression growing more strained as she listened. She turned back toward Mike, her voice low but firm. "Dispatch says we've got media inquiries flooding in. This is out of our hands now." Mike's face paled further. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "It means," Marcus interjected, his tone razor-sharp, "that your actions are now public record, and the court of public opinion isn't going to wait for your precinct to catch up." Rachel hesitated before addressing the crowd. "Officer Thompson will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation," she announced, though her voice was drowned out by boos and jeers. Marcus stepped forward again, silencing the crowd with a raised hand. "Administrative leave isn't justice," he said, his voice steady but fierce. "It's a temporary bandage on a festering wound. But don't worry, we're going to ensure this investigation doesn't just fade into the background. We'll make sure every detail of today's events is brought to light." Emily turned to the crowd, her voice carrying the same quiet power it had throughout. "This is why we don't back down," she said. "This is why we record, why we speak up, why we demand accountability. Because when we stand together, they can't ignore us." The crowd cheered again, their voices filled with hope and determination. Mike looked utterly defeated, his authority stripped away piece by piece. He glanced at Rachel, but her expression offered no solace. For the first time, he realized there would be no easy way out. Marcus turned back to Emily, his voice softening slightly. "This isn't just about holding one officer accountable," he said. "It's about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Emily nodded. "Then let's do it," she said. "Let's make sure no one else has to go through this." Weeks after the confrontation, the momentum sparked that night had grown into something far larger. Emily and Marcus became central figures in a rapidly expanding movement calling for systemic reform in policing. What began as a single incident on a crowded street had become a rallying cry for justice, drawing national attention. The first organized discussion was held in the very community where the incident occurred. The room was packed, with people from all walks of life crowding into every available seat, while others stood against the walls. Local leaders, activists, and concerned citizens came to listen, speak, and strategize. Marcus stood at the podium, addressing the crowd with the same unwavering determination he'd shown that night. "We are here because what happened to Emily shouldn't happen to anyone," he began. "But let's be clear, this isn't just about one officer or one policy. This is about dismantling a system that enables injustice and rebuilding one that serves everyone equally." Applause rippled through the room, but it was Emily's voice that brought the audience to complete silence. She stepped forward, her calm demeanor commanding attention. "I've been asked many times why I didn't back down," she said, her voice steady. "Why I stood my ground. The answer is simple. I knew that staying silent would mean letting it happen again. To someone else. To someone who might not have a crowd to support them, who might not have a camera recording." The audience nodded, their expressions reflecting understanding and solidarity. "But this," Emily continued, gesturing to the packed room, "this is how we fight back. Together, by standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let injustice go unanswered." From there, the movement gained traction nationwide. Emily and Marcus traveled to other communities, organizing forums and town halls that addressed the root causes of police misconduct. They pushed for mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and stronger accountability measures for officers who abuse their power. At one particularly charged meeting, a young woman stood up during the QA session. "I've always felt like my voice didn't matter," she said, her voice trembling. "But watching you, Emily, gave me the courage to speak out. Thank you for showing us we're not alone." Emily's response was firm, yet compassionate. "Your voice does matter," she said. "And when we all speak together, we can create change that no one can ignore." Their efforts began to yield tangible results. Local departments introduced new oversight policies, and state legislators began drafting bills aimed at reducing police bias and increasing transparency. Videos from the original incident continued to circulate online, serving as a powerful reminder of why the fight for justice was necessary. During a televised interview, Emily was asked what kept her motivated despite the challenges she faced. Her answer was clear and unwavering. "Justice isn't just a dream," she said. "It's a goal. It's something we have to work for, fight for, and demand. Because without it, we can't call ourselves a fair or equal society." The interviewer leaned in, visibly moved. "What do you hope people take away from your story?" Emily didn't hesitate. "That courage is contagious," she said. "When one person stands up, it inspires others to do the same. And together, we can accomplish what feels impossible alone." Months later, Emily returned to the same street where it all began. A rally was being held, with hundreds of people gathered in support of continued reforms. Marcus stood by her side as she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd falling silent in anticipation. "What happened here was just the beginning," she said, her voice steady but filled with passion. "That night we proved that power doesn't belong to a badge or a uniform. It belongs to the people. And when we stand together, we are unstoppable." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying across the city. Emily's voice rose again, cutting through the noise. "This fight isn't over," she said. "But today, we stand closer to justice than we did yesterday. And tomorrow, we'll be even closer still. Because this isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing minds, hearts, and systems." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before her. "So don't stop. Don't stop speaking out. Don't stop holding power accountable. And don't stop believing that change is possible. Because it is. And we are the ones who will make it happen." The crowd's response was deafening, their chants of "justice now" echoing down the streets. As the rally ended, Emily stood in the center of the crowd, surrounded by the people whose voices had joined hers. She felt a deep sense of pride and purpose. This was more than a moment. It was the start of a movement that wouldn't stop until justice wasn't just an aspiration, but a reality. The rally that day wasn't just a show of solidarity. It was a turning point, a moment that proved the power of collective action and unwavering courage. Emily's journey from being targeted to becoming a voice for change was a testament to the strength of standing firm in the face of injustice. But this isn't just Emily's fight. It's ours. How will you stand up for justice in your community? The fight for accountability and equality doesn't end here, and your voice is needed now more than ever. If this story resonated with you, help spread the message. Like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and push for change. Together we can make a difference.
The sun dipped below the skyline of downtown Atlanta, painting the city in hues of orange and pink. Officer Jack Thompson drove through the business district, his patrol car reflecting the fading light. It had been a long day, and his patience was wearing thin. At 35, Jack had spent over a decade on the force, and his job had come to define him. He prided himself on keeping the streets clean, even if his methods were sometimes questionable. To him, keeping order meant maintaining certain boundaries and deciding who belonged where. His colleagues called him dedicated, his superiors problematic. But Jack believed he was just doing what was necessary. The captain's voice still echoed in his ears from that morning's briefing. "Another incident like that, Thompson, and you're out," he'd said, his tone heavy with disappointment. Jack's blood had boiled with shame as he'd stood there, eyes fixed on the floor while his peers looked on. But what did they know? They weren't the ones who had to face the daily chaos on the streets. As he cruised past Monroe Tower, a glistening monolith of glass and steel, something caught his eye. A well-dressed black man stood by the entrance, seemingly out of place among the rushing office workers heading home. Jack's instincts kicked in. He slowed the car and watched. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, checking his watch every few seconds. Suspicious, Jack thought. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was this guy casing the place? Or maybe he was waiting for someone to let him in so he could pull some kind of con. Jack's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He'd seen it before, people acting like they belonged somewhere they didn't. This guy looked like trouble, and Jack wasn't going to let him get away with whatever he was planning. Jack pulled the car over and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he approached the man. He made sure his posture was intimidating, his hand hovering near his holster. "Hey!" Jack called out sharply, his voice carrying through the evening air. "What are you doing here?" The man turned slowly, his eyes meeting Jack's. He looked surprised but composed. "Good evening, officer," he said in a calm, measured tone. "I'm waiting for a meeting. I work here." Jack's eyes narrowed. He glanced up at the building and then back at the man. "You work here?" he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You got any ID to prove that?" The man nodded, reaching into his pocket. "Of course," he said, pulling out a badge and extending it towards Jack. "David Williams, Executive Director." Jack snatched the badge from his hand and looked at it briefly. It looked legitimate, but something about this guy's calm demeanor rubbed him the wrong way. He shoved the badge back into David's hand. "Executive Director of what?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. David held his gaze, unflinching. "Of this building, officer. I'm the new CEO of Williams & Associates. We just moved our headquarters here." Jack let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You right? And I'm the President of the United States," he sneered. "You expect me to believe that you're the CEO of this place?" David's expression tightened, but he kept his composure. "Officer, if you contact the building security, they'll confirm who I am." Jack shook his head, ignoring the suggestion. He felt his anger rising. This guy was too calm, too collected, like he thought he was better than everyone else. Jack's mind flashed back to his childhood, to the rich neighborhoods his mother used to clean. He remembered the disdainful looks, the way people like this guy had treated his family as if they were invisible. And now, here was this man standing in front of him, acting like he owned the place. "I don't need to check anything," Jack snapped. "I know your type. You think you could just walk in here, dressed up like that, and nobody's going to ask questions?" David took a deep breath, his jaw clenching for a moment before he spoke. "Officer, I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just here for a meeting. If you'd like, I can call the person I'm meeting with." "Enough!" Jack cut him off, stepping closer, his voice rising. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You think you can just pull out a fancy card and make me go away?" David held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Please, there's no need for this. I've done nothing wrong." Jack's eyes blazed. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, the familiar rush of control. "You're trespassing, and you're resisting a lawful order," he shouted, his face inches from David's. David's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of real fear. "I'm not resisting anything, officer. I'm just asking you to check." "I said enough." Jack's voice boomed. The crowd around them was growing, people pulling out their phones, whispering among themselves. But Jack didn't care. His focus was solely on David, on putting this man in his place. David looked around, seeing the phones pointed at them, the concerned faces watching. His face flushed with humiliation. He looked back at Jack, and his voice was low, almost pleading. "You're making a mistake." The words ignited something in Jack, a spark of rage that he couldn't contain. "A mistake," he snarled, his voice thick with contempt. "You think you're going to tell me how to do my job?" Without warning, Jack shoved David hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward. The briefcase fell from David's hand, its contents spilling onto the sidewalk, documents scattering like leaves. David struggled to regain his balance, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Pick it up," Jack barked, his face red with anger. "Pick up your stuff and get the hell out of here." David hesitated, glancing down at the scattered papers. His hands shook slightly as he knelt, gathering the documents. The crowd murmured, a few people stepping forward, but nobody intervened. They just watched, their phones capturing every humiliating second. As David picked up the last of the papers, he looked up at Jack, his eyes filled not with anger, but with something else, something almost like pity. "You really don't know what you're doing," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the street. Jack's lips curled into a sneer. "And what's that supposed to mean?" he snapped. Before David could respond, the building manager burst through the doors, his face pale and eyes wide. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, rushing over. "Officer, stop this right now!" Jack turned, taken aback by the man's panicked tone. "Stay out of this," he warned, but the manager ignored him, kneeling beside David. "Mr. Williams, are you all right?" the manager asked, his voice laced with worry. He turned to Jack, fury in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Jack felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at David, who was now standing, dusting off his suit. "This man," the manager said, pointing to David, "is the new CEO of the company that owns this building." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jack's mind went blank. He stared at David, his heart hammering in his chest. This couldn't be real. The man he'd just humiliated, the man he'd treated like a criminal, was the new CEO. David straightened, holding up his ID for the crowd to see. "I tried to tell him," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor of pain that crossed his face. But he wouldn't listen. Jack's mouth went dry. He glanced around, seeing the judgment in the faces of the onlookers, the condemnation in their eyes. The phones, still pointed at him, captured every agonizing second of his disgrace. He wanted to disappear, to vanish from this nightmare. David looked at him, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that gaze, Jack saw no anger, no rage, only disappointment and something deeper, something that made his stomach twist with shame. "Officer," David said softly, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to go to my meeting." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He stood there, paralyzed, as David turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him like a sea. The manager shot Jack a look of pure disdain before following David into the building. Jack felt the world close and around him, the weight of his actions crashing down like a tidal wave. He had lost control. He had humiliated an innocent man, no more than that, someone who could end his career with a single phone call. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Jack stood alone on the sidewalk, the reality of what he'd done sinking in. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, a voice whispered a chilling truth. He deserved every bit of what was coming. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall of his small apartment. His uniform, still stained with the grime of the day, lay crumpled in a heap on the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The events of the afternoon played over and over in his head like a nightmare on repeat. No matter how much he wanted to wake up, he couldn't escape the reality of what he'd done. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the silence. He hesitated before picking it up, his heart pounding. The screen was filled with notifications, missed calls, messages, emails. All from people he knew, colleagues, friends, even his family. But he couldn't bring himself to open any of them. He knew what they would say. They would all be the same. Disbelief, anger, disappointment. He threw the phone back down, his hands trembling. What had he been thinking? He'd let his temper get the better of him, and now he was going to pay for it. He could already see the headlines. Veteran officer assaults innocent man in broad daylight. His stomach churned at the thought. Jack stood up abruptly, pacing the room. He needed to get out, to clear his head. He grabbed his jacket and keys, leaving the mess of his apartment behind as he stepped out into the chilly night air. The streets were quiet, the city a far cry from the chaos of earlier. He walked aimlessly, his thoughts a jumbled mess of regret and anger, mostly at himself. He turned the corner and found himself in front of a familiar bar, a place he used to frequent with his colleagues after long shifts. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The dimly lit interior was almost empty, save for a few regulars hunched over their drinks. Jack slid onto a stool at the bar, nodding at the bartender. "Rough day?" the bartender asked, setting down a glass of whiskey in front of him without Jack even having to ask. Jack let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea," he muttered, taking a long sip. The warmth of the alcohol did little to dull the gnawing guilt in his gut. The bartender gave him a sympathetic look. "You want to talk about it?" Jack shook his head. "Not much to say. Just screwed up big time." He stared into his glass, the whiskey reflecting his troubled expression. He could still see David's face, the calm, dignified way he'd handled the entire humiliating encounter. And then the look on his face when Jack had hit him, That was what haunted Jack the most. There hadn't been anger or fear, just a kind of sad resignation, like he'd expected it. He downed the rest of his drink in one gulp, signaling for another. As the bartender poured, Jack's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, seeing a message from his mother. His heart sank. He knew she must have seen the video by now. The thought of her watching it, seeing her son behave like that, made his chest tighten with shame. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, unable to bear reading her words. "What happened, man?" The bartender's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Jack looked up, surprised by the question. He didn't usually talk about work, especially not to strangers. But tonight, the weight of what he'd done was crushing him. He needed to unload, to say something before it drove him insane. "I messed up," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." The bartender raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. "We all make mistakes," he said, his tone gentle. Jack shook his head, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was different. I let my temper get the best of me, and now I don't know what's going to happen." The bartender nodded, leaning on the counter. "Sounds like you've got some serious thinking to do." Jack let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's putting it lightly." He took another sip, the burn of the whiskey doing little to calm his nerves. As the night wore on, the bar began to fill up, but Jack barely noticed. He was lost in his thoughts, replaying the incident over and over, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. He'd let his prejudice cloud his judgment. The realization made him feel sick. He'd always prided himself on being fair, on doing what was right. But today, he'd been no better than the thugs he'd spent his career trying to put away. He thought about David again, the way he kept his dignity even in the face of Jack's hostility. Jack felt a pang of something he wasn't used to, shame. How could he have been so blind, so full of hate that he couldn't see the person standing right in front of him? The door of the bar swung open, and a group of off-duty officers walked in, laughing and talking loudly. Jack turned away, hoping they wouldn't notice him. But it was too late. "Thompson," one of them called out, a broad smile on his face. "What are you doing here, man? Thought you'd be out celebrating." Jack forced a smile, his insides churning. "Yeah, something like that," he mumbled. The group pulled up stools next to him, oblivious to his discomfort. They ordered drinks, chatting about the day's events. Jack tried to tune them out, but their voices cut through his thoughts like a knife. "You hear about that video going around?" One of them said, his tone laced with amusement. "Some cop laid out a guy right in front of Monroe Tower. Can you believe it?" Jack's blood turned to ice. He felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their smiles fading as they took in his expression. "No way," another officer said, his eyes wide with realization. "That was you, wasn't it?" Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. The group fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a dark cloud. The officer who had spoken first let out a low whistle. "Damn, Thompson, you really screwed up." Jack stood abruptly, knocking his stool over in his haste. He threw a few bills on the bar and walked out, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. Outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He felt like he was drowning, the pressure of his actions crushing him. He knew he couldn't run from this, couldn't hide from the mess he'd made, but he didn't know how to face it either. As he stood there, his phone buzzed again. With shaking hands, he pulled it out and read the message from his mother. "Call me. We need to talk." Jack stared at the screen, his throat tightening. He knew she would try to comfort him, to tell him everything would be all right. But he also knew it wouldn't be true. Nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had barely risen when Jack pulled into the parking lot of the precinct. He sat in his car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, the tension in his shoulders a heavy, oppressive weight. Today was the day he would have to face the consequences of his actions. His suspension was just the beginning. Now, with David Williams leading the investigation, Jack knew that his entire career hung in the balance. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way inside. The air was thick with tension as he walked through the station. Officers who had once greeted him with nods or pats on the back now averted their eyes. Whispers followed him as he made his way down the hall, his gaze fixed on the floor. The shame he felt was palpable, a constant ache in his chest. He reached the conference room and hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He knew what awaited him inside, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. He closed his eyes, drawing in a deep breath before pushing the door open. The room was packed. Several officers, including the captain, sat around the table, their expressions grim. At the head of the table sat David Williams, looking calm and composed, despite the bruise still visible on his cheek. His presence dominated the room, a stark reminder of what Jack had done. Jack's heart pounded as he stepped inside, the door closing with a heavy thud behind him. He felt like he was walking into his own execution. David glanced up, his gaze meeting Jack's for a split second before he turned back to the papers in front of him. A young woman stood beside him, flipping through a thick stack of documents. She looked up, her eyes cold as she watched Jack take his seat. "Officer Thompson," she began, her voice firm and businesslike. "I'm Sarah Collins, Mr. Williams' legal counsel. We're here today to discuss the events of last week and the subsequent investigation into your conduct." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. His mouth was dry, and he struggled to find his voice. "Yes, ma'am." The captain, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Jack. "Thompson, do you understand the severity of the situation you've put yourself in?" Jack nodded again, his heart hammering in his chest. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Collins continued, her gaze fixed on Jack. "We've reviewed the footage of the incident, as well as the statements from witnesses. It's clear that your actions were not only unprofessional, but also indicative of a deeper issue within the department." Jack flinched at her words, shame washing over him like a wave. He glanced at David, but the other man's expression was unreadable. Jack wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he knew there was no defense for what he'd done. He'd let his anger, his prejudice, take over, and now he was paying the price. "We'll be conducting a thorough review of your past conduct," Sarah continued. "Any similar incidents will be considered as part of this investigation." Jack felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew his record wasn't spotless. There had been other complaints, other instances where he'd crossed the line. He'd always managed to get off with a warning or a slap on the wrist, but now it was different. The room was silent as Sarah handed a folder to David, who flipped through it slowly, his eyes scanning the pages. Jack watched him, his stomach twisting in knots. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, David looked up, his gaze locking onto Jack's. "Officer Thompson," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Jack nodded, his palms sweating. "Of course." David's eyes were piercing, and Jack had to force himself not to look away. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Jack felt his heart skip a beat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Why had he done it? The answer was so simple, yet so impossible to say. He'd let his fear, his anger, his own prejudices get the better of him. But how could he admit that, sitting here in front of the man he'd humiliated? Jack's voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, trying again. "I made a mistake. I let my emotions take over." David didn't look convinced. "Your emotions?" he echoed, his tone disbelieving. "What kind of emotions make a man act like that?" Jack felt his face flush with shame. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting for his response. "I was angry," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I thought you didn't belong there." There. He'd said it. The truth. Ugly and raw. He'd looked at David and judged him, decided he didn't belong, all because of the color of his skin. It was a hard thing to admit, even to himself. Jack felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring as he stared down at the table. David was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "You thought I didn't belong because I'm black." It wasn't a question, but Jack nodded anyway, unable to meet his eyes. The room was so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know what it's like, Officer Thompson?" he asked softly. "To be judged like that, every day of your life? Jack shook his head, his chest tightening with guilt. He had no idea. He'd never even thought about it. He'd spent his life believing he was the one under attack, that he had to defend himself and his way of life. But he'd never stopped to consider how his actions, his words, affected others. David let out a soft sigh. "I don't want to see you lose your job, Jack," he said quietly, surprising everyone in the room. "But something has to change." Jack looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "What do you mean?" David's gaze was steady. "I'm willing to drop the charges," he said, glancing at his lawyer, who looked shocked. "But on one condition." Jack's heart leapt with hope. "Anything." David leaned forward, his eyes boring into Jack's. "You have to take responsibility for what you've done. Not just to me, but to everyone you've wronged. You need to understand why you acted the way you did, and you need to change." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. "How?" he whispered, his voice shaky. David's expression softened slightly. "There's a program," he said. "It's designed to help people confront their biases, to learn and grow. I want you to attend it, and I want you to share your story publicly." Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. The thought of standing in front of people, admitting what he'd done, terrified him. But he knew he had no choice. If he didn't, he'd lose everything. His career, his reputation, his future. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I'll do whatever it takes." David nodded slowly. "Good," he said, his gaze never leaving Jack's. "Because this isn't just about you, Officer Thompson. It's about changing a system that's been broken for a long time. And that starts with you." The room was silent as Jack absorbed his words. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his actions, the impact they had on others. And he realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. But maybe, just maybe, it was a journey worth taking. Jack stood outside the community center, his heart pounding in his chest. It was an old, nondescript building in a quieter part of the city, far removed from the hustle and bustle of downtown Atlanta. A banner above the door read, "Unity through Understanding," and beneath it, smaller letters spelled out, "Bias Awareness and Reconciliation Program." Jack swallowed hard. He hadn't been sure he would come, even after agreeing to David's condition. But now that he was here, he felt the familiar wave of anxiety and resistance rise in his chest. He glanced at the people walking past him, wondering what they would think if they knew who he was and why he was here. After all, the video of his confrontation with David had spread like wildfire. People knew his face, and worse, they knew his actions. He felt exposed, as if he was walking around with a giant neon sign above his head that read, "This man made a terrible mistake." Taking a deep breath, Jack pushed open the door and stepped inside. The small lobby was filled with pamphlets and posters promoting various support groups and community programs. He could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from down the hall. A receptionist looked up from her desk, giving him a polite smile. "Welcome. Are you here for the bias awareness session?" she asked, her voice gentle. Jack nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I'm Jack Thompson." The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and he saw the recognition flicker in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, nodding as she handed him a name tag. "We're glad to have you here, Officer Thompson. The session is just down the hall, first door on the left." "Thanks," Jack muttered, taking the name tag and sticking it to his shirt. He made his way down the hall, his stomach churning with nerves. What was he even doing here? How could sitting in a circle and talking about his feelings possibly fix the mess he'd made? He paused outside the door, the low hum of conversation drifting through the air. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was set up in a circle, with about a dozen chairs filled by people of various ages and backgrounds. Some looked up as he entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. Jack recognized a few faces from the videos and articles that had surfaced online, activists, community leaders, and even a few people he'd arrested during his career. A wave of shame washed over him, and he had to fight the urge to turn and leave. "Come on in," a voice called from across the room. A middle-aged man with graying hair and a kind smile gestured to an empty chair. "We're just getting started. I'm Paul, the facilitator. You must be Officer Thompson." Jack nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He felt all eyes on him as he crossed the room and sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clenched in his lap. "Welcome, Jack," Paul said warmly. "We appreciate you being here. It takes courage to face your mistakes and try to make things right." Jack's jaw tightened. Courage. That word felt hollow in his ears. Was it really courage when he didn't have a choice? When this was the only way to salvage what was left of his life? Paul continued, introducing the other members of the group, many of whom shared brief stories of their own experiences with bias, discrimination, and the impact it had on their lives. Jack listened, his gut twisting with each account. There was a young woman who'd been harassed at work because of her accent, an elderly man who'd been treated like a suspect for decades because of the color of his skin, and a teacher who'd been targeted for being openly gay in a conservative community. As each person spoke, Jack felt the weight of their words settling on his shoulders, heavier and heavier. His own actions seemed even more shameful in the face of their courage and resilience. When it was his turn to speak, he hesitated, his mouth dry. I don't really know what to say," he began, his voice shaky. He glanced around the circle, seeing the guarded expressions on the faces of the people around him. "I've made some mistakes, big ones, and I'm trying to figure out why." He paused, the silence in the room pressing down on him. He could feel their skepticism, their doubt. Why should they believe him? He'd spent years enforcing the law, believing he was on the right side of justice. And now, here he was trying to explain himself to the very people he'd wronged. "I've been a cop for a long time," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I thought I was doing my job, protecting people. But I see now that I've hurt people too. I judged them without even realizing it. I thought I knew what was right, what was best. But I didn't. I was wrong." His words hung in the air, the room silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Jack felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never felt before. He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the people he'd dismissed as criminals, as troublemakers, without ever truly seeing them. A young man with a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve leaned forward, his eyes hard. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. "Why do you care now? After all the damage you've done?" Jack flinched, the question hitting him like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. Because I saw what I'd become. I saw myself in that video, and I didn't recognize the person I was looking at. I don't want to be that man anymore." The room was silent, the tension thick. Jack felt a bead of sweat trickle down his back. He didn't know what else to say, how to make them believe that he was sincere. He knew words wouldn't be enough. Paul nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "It's a start, Jack. Acknowledging that you were wrong is the first step, but it's not the only step." Jack nodded, swallowing hard. He felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being angry, tired of the man he'd become. He just wanted to find a way to make things right. The session continued, with each person sharing their stories and feelings. Jack listened, his heart aching with every word. He realized slowly, painfully, that this was what he'd been missing all along, listening. He'd spent his life speaking, judging, acting, but he'd never truly listened. As the session drew to a close, Paul stood up, smiling warmly at the group. "Thank you all for sharing. Remember, change is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But with time and effort, we can all learn to see each other differently." The group began to disperse, people milling around, talking quietly among themselves. Jack stood feeling drained. He was about to leave when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see the young man with the tattoo looking at him, his expression still guarded but less hostile. "You've got a long way to go, man," he said quietly. "But at least you're here." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thanks," he murmured, not trusting himself to say more. As he left the building, the cool evening air hit his face, a reminder of how much his world had changed in such a short time. He still had a lot to figure out, a lot to learn, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to be better. The auditorium was packed. Rows of people, from students to community leaders, filled the seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity, and skepticism. Jack stood at the back, hidden in the shadows, watching the crowd grow. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat as he glanced at the podium set up at the front of the stage. Beside it was a banner that read, Community Forum on Racial Reconciliation and Justice. This was it, the culmination of the past few weeks. Therapy sessions, workshops, and hours spent confronting his own prejudices and mistakes. Jack had attended every session of the program, listening to stories from people who had been marginalized and mistreated. He had shared his own story, faced the anger and pain of those he had wronged, and for the first time in his life, he had begun to understand. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was expected to stand before this crowd and talk about what he had learned. As the last of the audience settled into their seats, a hush fell over the room. David Williams stepped onto the stage, his presence commanding attention. Jack felt a pang of anxiety, remembering their first meeting, the anger and shame he had felt. But David had shown him more grace than he deserved. He had guided Jack through the process, even though he had every reason to turn his back. David adjusted the microphone, his calm gaze sweeping over the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is about more than just talking. It's about listening, understanding, and finding a path forward." There was a murmur of agreement, the crowd leaning in as David spoke. Jack felt his heart clench. David had become a respected voice in the community, a symbol of strength and resilience. And now, here he was ready to give Jack the chance to make things right, or at least to begin to. David glanced toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Jack's. He gave a small nod, and Jack felt his stomach drop. It was time. He took a deep breath, his legs shaky as he made his way down the aisle. Every step felt heavy, like he was walking through quicksand. As he reached the stage, David extended a hand, pulling Jack up beside him. "Many of you know who this man is," David said, his voice steady. "You've seen the video. You know what happened. But what you don't know is the journey we've been on since that day." Jack's throat tightened as he took the microphone from David, his hands trembling. He looked out at the sea of faces, all watching him intently. For a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. But then he saw his mother, sitting in the front row, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and pride. She had been his rock through all of this, encouraging him to keep going, to be better. And she was here, supporting him, even after everything. He took another deep breath, forcing himself to speak. "I don't really know where to start," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've spent my whole life believing I was a good guy, that I was doing the right thing, protecting people. But I wasn't. I was protecting myself, my beliefs, my prejudices." He paused, glancing at David, who gave him a reassuring nod. "What I did to David was wrong. It was more than just a mistake. It was a reflection of a system that's been broken for a long time. And I was a part of that system." Jack's gaze swept over the crowd, seeing the skepticism, the doubt in their eyes. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince them that he had changed, but he had to try. "I hurt people," he continued, his voice stronger now. "Not just David, but others. People who didn't deserve it. People I judged because of their skin color, their clothes, where they were standing. I thought I was justified, but I wasn't." He glanced down at his hands, at the calluses and scars. They had been his tools, his weapons. But now, they felt like a reminder of everything he had done wrong. "I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand why I did what I did. And the truth is, there's no excuse. I was afraid of what I didn't understand. And that fear turned into anger, into hate." The room was silent, every eye on him. Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't bother wiping it away. "I can't change what I did," he said softly, "but I can change who I am. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking for the chance to be better." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It was a hesitant sound at first, but then others joined in, and soon the room was filled with applause. Jack looked around, stunned, as people nodded and murmured their approval. David stepped forward, taking the microphone back. "Thank you, Jack," he said, his voice filled with emotion. It takes courage to stand up and admit when you're wrong. And it takes even more courage to change. He turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them. We have a long way to go. This isn't the end of the journey. It's just the beginning. But if we can listen to each other, if we can learn from each other, then we can start to make real change. The applause grew louder. People standing, some wiping away tears. Jack felt a sense of relief wash over him, a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was a start. After the event, people mingled in the lobby, talking quietly among themselves. Jack stood off to the side, unsure of what to do. He had never been good at these kinds of things, and now, with so much hanging over him, he felt even more out of place. A man approached him, his expression serious. Jack tensed, bracing himself for whatever was coming. But the man held out his hand. "My name's Marcus," he said, his voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up." Jack stared at the outstretched hand, then took it, shaking it firmly. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded, his grip strong. "What you did, it means something. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." Jack nodded, unable to find the words. He watched as Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see David standing beside him, a small smile on his face. "You did good, Jack," he said quietly. "You've got a long road ahead, but I believe in you." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." David nodded, his eyes kind. "It's not about you and me anymore, Jack. It's about all of us, about making this world a better place." Jack looked around the room, at the people talking and laughing, at the connections being made. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could do it. Maybe they could change. As he left the auditorium that night, the cool breeze on his face, Jack felt a sense of peace. He had a lot to make up for, a lot to learn, but he was ready. Ready to listen, to understand, to be better. And for the first time in his life, he knew that he wasn't alone. They were all in this together, and together they could find a way forward, a way to heal, to grow, to become the people they were meant to be. Because change, real change, started with each of them, and it started now.